You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. As Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. You can make this possible. Well, you know, big tech matters, folks, in this country, and social media executives answered to Congress today for their role in the January 6 attacks on the U.S. Capitol. Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, Twitter's Jack Dorsey, and Google's Sundar Pichai all appeared virtually before a joint House committee. Y'all want to roll a video today?
I want to start by asking all three of you if your platform bears some responsibility for disseminating disinformation related to the election and the Stop the Steal movement that led to the attack on the Capitol. Just a yes or no answer. Mr. Zuckerberg.
Chairman, I think our responsibility is to build systems that can help.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I just want a yes or no answer, okay? Yes or no, do you bear some responsibility for what happened?
Congressman, our responsibility is to make sure that we build effective systems to help fight this
gentleman's choice is not to answer the question. Mr. Pichai, yes or no?
We always feel a deep sense of responsibility, but I think we worked hard. This election effort was one of our most substantive efforts.
Is that a yes or a no?
Congressman, it's a complex question.
Okay, we'll move on. Mr. Dorsey.
Yes, but you also have to take into consideration a broader ecosystem. It's not just about the technology platforms we use.
Thank you. Thank you. And I agree with that.
Other concerns include disinformation and extremist campaigns that flourish on social media. Joining me now is social media analyst and diversity strategist Shireen Mitchell, Dr. Dominique Harrison, Director of Technology Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Dominique, I want to start with you. This is what I find to be quite interesting in this conversation. You saw the members saying, hey, do you take responsibility? These tech companies they must confront lies and misinformation with their desperation for profits, especially Facebook. Dominique, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So, yes, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity. Totally agree with what you just said. I watched most of the hearing today. A lot of things stood out to me. First was there is a lack of, recognition around the kind of challenges that are facing Black people as a result of the platforms that they own. We know that online platforms can exacerbate discrimination, voter suppression tactics, and race-based extremism. What we don't know is the extent to which the government needs to regulate tech companies to prevent this kind of behavior. There's a lack of accountability by tech CEOs regarding the roles their platform plays in online disinformation. Their company codes of conduct, ethic boards, stakeholder groups, all kind of self-policing activities are not enough. And the American public has no real knowledge about the enforcement of the disinformation policies adopted by these companies or their effectiveness. We lack a full understanding of the impact of disinformation on Black communities and other communities of color. And we only receive that kind of information when an outside group does research on the company and their kinds of services, and with that we learn about the harms that those technologies have on communities of color. So social media companies need to be providing more transparency and accountability about the enforcement and effectiveness of their moderation policies, because they need to understand that there are real world consequences for what people do online. We saw that in the January 6th insurrection on Capitol Hill, right? Social media companies were slow to move racist, abusive, and hateful language long before that happened. And it wasn't until advocacy groups started saying that, you have to take off this content, you have to moderate what you see online, because it can end up in having what we saw on January 6th. So what we're advocating for at the Joint Center is that Section 230 be reformed, right, to say that tech companies can't say that they have liability. They're shielded from taking down content that's racist, right, or that espouses hateful messages and that has discriminatory outcomes on Black communities. So that's just a little bit of what I saw today.
You know, Shireen, when I talked about, again, the business plan, the reality is this here. Facebook has made billions off of the misinformation. The reports have all come out how they, during the last 4 years of Trump, they literally paved the way for right-wing people, Dan Bongino, the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, folks like that. Breitbart. They literally changed the rules because they knew these crazy white conservatives, they eat that stuff up and they consume and spend so much time and money there on Facebook. So they've got to own up to them creating the financial system to allow it to thrive for misinformation and lies and terroristic activity to go unabated.
So I would have to agree in multiple forms based on this, Roland, in terms of what you're saying. And I also want to agree with what was just said. It's not only that they're benefiting from it, but it's also that they also are profiting from it. They're profiting from the hate. They're profiting from the anger. And we also know, though, that with the last few reports is that literally they have the AI to stop hate speech on the platforms, but they're deciding not to do it because they feel like it's biased to one political party versus another. That's a choice that they're making. If this is even across both political parties, then we're fair to say hate speech should not be on their platforms. But what they're doing is they're trying to basically say there's certain portions of this that's free speech, and there's certain groups of people get more privilege than others, and that's what's different about their quote unquote following their terms of service, which they're not. But they are actually allowing the harassment, they're allowing extremism because they're basically saying, hey, this is free speech. What they're doing different in America versus in other countries is that what we're dealing with is them saying, hey, if it's a foreign actor doing this, we will take it down and we will respond to it. But if it's a domestic actor, we'll leave it because this, the freedom of speech for Americans is different, even though that freedom of speech can include incitement to violence, death threats, or targeting certain groups of people. And something really important that Zuck said today, Zuckerberg, was that he was okay with Section 230 being changed with two caveats, which is, making sure there's clearly illegal stuff is being added to the Section 230. When you say clearly illegal, that also means that you can't use domestic terrorism as a framework because there's no law that focuses on domestic terrorism, and there's no law that makes it possible to call out what we have been dealing with, which is white domestic terrorism in this country, which is what the insurrection ended up being. So there's this fine line that they're also trying to walk through in terms of the legislation and regulations, things that they're agreeing with. But also the key thing that I think is very important that is being brought up is that they don't feel that they should be held accountable for other people's actions, which is not the experience for most users. And they are saying, we want you to be here present, but we're not going to protect you. And here's all the reasons why. And those are the types of things I heard today when they couldn't answer just simple yes or no answers. It was a whole bunch of caveats. There was quote unquote nuances. But at the end of the day, what they were saying was what happened was harmful and problematic, but they should not be held accountable because of XYZ, while they're purposely, in some instances, not taking down certain content, and they're also banning certain people from speaking up, which is Black and brown people, when they're trying to defend themselves against the harms inflicted upon them on these platforms. And Bobby Rush asked a very specific question. Where's your audit to Jack Dorsey? And Dorsey had a different answer, which was, oh, we're going to go to civil rights organizations. We just threw out the audit framework.
Questions from my panel. I'm going to start with Amisha.
Sure. Sorry, I was on mute. After watching the testimony today, my big question is, what are the limits? So if we are to push in terms of restrictions, and I hear what you say about about how they act towards international actors who do negative things, specifically spreading misinformation and lies. But what is the slippery slope between that in pushing too far and specifically targeting minority groups? Because what we've seen when we've initiated this type of action before is that the groups that you expect to get targeted never were. But groups like Black Lives Matter and groups that were organizing Black people always tend to be the ones that fall under the ire. How are we to stop that type of action on these platforms?
So if this is for me, I just want to make sure that you're talking to me. I have an answer to that. Yes. Okay. Yes. So the thing is, this is the key about free speech and the like. They use the conversation about marginalized people being most affected by the way in which we handle free speech. But the truth is, at this moment, free speech has not protected us. And they're not protecting us right now in this moment. They're not using that free speech model for the Black Lives Matter people, for us. They're actually in opposite, basically banning us and suspending us for speaking up. And so when people say to me, well, what happens next if this will be a bigger effect on Black Lives Matter or anyone else, it's already happening. What we're not doing right now is calling out the fact that it's already happening, and what we need to do right now that is not being covered. It isn't about the right for people who are inflicting harm, who are inciting violence. We're protecting them over us protecting those people who are being targeted. And we need to rethink that.
Brittany, your question for our panel.
Yeah, Amisha, I loved your question. That was my question for them. We're thinking about that balance because we know so many of our various activist groups and educators are being shadow banned. They're seeing a decrease in their engagement when they're talking about eliminating white supremacy and talking about organizing via these platforms. But I guess I'm interested in how can we get these CEOs to be more transparent in terms of the ways in which they're using their AI. I just think it's fascinating that they're able so quickly to silence the voices of Black activists, but they are not able to silence, these white supremacists. What is their argument there, and what can the community do to push them in the right direction?
Dominique?
Yeah, those are really great points. I mean, it's important that we understand the algorithms, right? The data sets that they are using in which their tools operate and how their services operate online, whether it is them providing that information to a third-party entity or giving that information to government. We need to understand how those technologies are working and the impact that it has on our communities. But they do not, outright kind of give that information to anybody, right? Some of that is for proprietary concerns, but the point is that we need to understand the implications of these technologies, right? So we can understand how they're operating, but also what other kind of interventions can be used to make sure that we are not having more harm on communities of color. So there are legislation right now, right, that members have introduced to say that these tech companies should be audited to see how their algorithms are working, what kind of data sets they're using, but nothing has been passed yet. And so a lot of civil rights organizations and advocates are pushing for some of this legislation to pass to make sure that we are indeed holding these companies accountable. Because even though they may have research teams that are housed inside these organizations, sometimes, as we've seen lately, those researchers, many of times people of color and women, are pushed out, or their research is not deemed as being worthy of publication. And that research is very much centering Black folks in the conversation and the concerns that we have with regards to technology.
Greg Carr.
And can I?
I'm sorry, Shireen, go ahead, then Greg Carr.
Yeah, so I just want to highlight that because she was picking up on some of the things that happened with Timnit, who was doing ethical AI. If you're a Black person trying to do ethical AI for any of these companies, you're not welcomed. And you can tell that by what just happened with Timnit. But the other piece that I also want to say is that when there is transparency projects, like the one that was in NYU that was focused on the transparency projects of the political ads, Facebook actually tried to shut those things down. So what we need to deal with is the fact that there are projects already present that are not being utilized properly and also being shut down by the companies, and Congress needs to actually focus on the regulations to make sure those projects can continue to exist.
Greg Carr.
Thank you, Roland. And thank you both, Shireen and Dominique. As we see this damn ad with this sister every 30 seconds on social media, 25 years ago from Facebook, talking about the Communication Decency Act of 1996. Thank you for walking us through how that Section 230 is really the only thing there, and it's protecting them because they're private actors. What can we take and learn from attempts in recent years, 2018 with sex trafficking, 2020 with the Earn It attempt, which has some bipartisan sponsorship? What can we learn from these attempts to quote unquote regulate, as you say, Dominique, try to regulate the extent to which these private actors can hide behind that third party content immunity? What can we learn from these previous attempts so that we can basically call Zuckerberg's bluff and put some teeth in regulation? And I say that because he's clearly been out here saying, we want you to do it. We want you to regulate us, realizing that that the response could be to put some regulation in that would only require them to make a good faith effort, which means they still wouldn't have to comply with anything. And how comfortable are you all with attempting to go past that? And can we learn anything from previous attempts to regulate them around issues like sex trafficking?
So, I mean, we think it's very important that Section 230 at least stands, but we need to reform it, right? We need something that still, says to tech companies, you should remove content that is harassment, that is, negative, whatever. So we need that kind of regulation still standing. But I think what you're getting to is that we certainly need bipartisan support on this issue. Today in the hearing, what I saw was Republicans focusing on children and the impacts of technology, which is important. And Section 230 does help in protecting child pornography not being on contents. But we also need to understand the discrimination that is happening because of these technologies and the data in which they are using. And so we need people on both sides of the aisle to understand this is a real problem and to come to some agreement with passing legislation. Another concern of ours is around privacy, right, and how that relates to Black folks and discriminatory outcomes of the personal use of their information. We need that to be federal legislation because there are states right now coming up with their own rules, right? This is why tech companies want some kind of federal law so that they don't have to comply with California privacy laws or New York privacy laws. Well, the point is that without this kind of legislation at the highest level, then they are out to do whatever they want, and they can come up with their principles and they can come up with good ethics and good ways to do business, but still end up harming the communities that are vulnerable and the ones that we care about the most.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And my answer to that is, the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights actually has a document called DDoS, which is a play on DOS. DDoS. But there's a framework there for the legal aspects from a state perspective on basically claiming that social media companies are public spaces and using the public spaces law that could be utilized in some of this. So I think there's ways that we can do this that does not even have to go through Congress, but that can be a state level framework that we look at in terms of how we can hold these companies accountable. Because they're saying regulation, but they're also dancing around what that regulation looks like. Zuckerberg actually admitted to wanting transparency documents from all the groups while he's blocking that, right? But he's also said something about making sure that there was clear illegal aspects that they can follow. So if we put those laws in place, then that makes it legal, to clear legal lines that they have to deal with in terms of public spaces. So I think there's ways to deal with this. I just think that we're not being forward enough about how to navigate that in terms of that regulation, but also the existing laws.
All righty. Dominique and Shireen, we surely appreciate it. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, folks, back to our Roland Mark Unfiltered video in just one moment.
It's time to be smart. When we control our institutions, we win. This is the most important news show on television of any racial background. Y'all put $2, $3, $4, $5, $10, $15, $20, $30 on this and keep this going. What you've done, Roland, since this crisis came out in full bloom. Anybody watching this, tell your friends, Go back and look at the last 2 weeks, especially of Roland Martin Unfiltered. I mean, hell, go back and look at the last 2 days. You've had sitting United States senators today, Klobuchar and Harris. Whatever you have that you can bring to Roland Martin Unfiltered to support it, please do, because this information may literally save your life.
Watch Roland Martin Unfiltered daily at 6 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, Facebook, or Periscope, or go to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered Daily Digital Show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.